Welcome to another edition of Conversation with First Baptist Church. I'm Larry Dixon, and with me today is Suzanne Mantooth. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
I always have a list of questions for people. So tell me about where you grew up and what life was like as a little girl.
That is one of the hardest questions anybody ever asked me, because I was the child of a minister back in the days when they only stayed at churches 2 to 3 years. So I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, right after my dad came home from the war, and he pastored a little church in a bedroom community of Nashville. Then we moved to Kentucky, to Bethel Baptist outside of Harrodsburg. Then we moved to Stearns, Kentucky. We lived in Clarksville, Indiana in a little interim period before that. We lived in Louisville. We lived in Wheelwright in Floyd County. And then we moved to Pineville in Bell County, where I graduated from high school. So my experience growing up was under the guise of the parishioners of whatever church my father was pastoring. So I always felt like I had to be on my best behavior, always. And I loved my dad dearly and would never have done anything to compromise his ministry in any way. So I was a pretty straight arrow.
So growing up, what was your dream job?
Well, I guess I didn't really have one. In high school, I loved biology. But I was also studying piano with a Russian professor whose father was a contemporary with a really famous Russian composer. And he himself would go on train rides with this Russian composer when they went on concert tours. And I got really interested in piano, partly because he had such a thick Russian accent. And of course, this was the 60s, and we're supposed to be afraid of Russians. So I would practice 3 and 4 hours a day just to please him. And I really loved him. And he really was a wonderful teacher. And the nursing education was cheaper than going to Georgetown College. Even though I had won a music scholarship to Georgetown, it was still way more expensive than my parents could afford. So I went to Kentucky Baptist Hospital School of Nursing and became a nurse and worked, did some extra training at Good Sam in Lexington in coronary intensive care, and was on the initial staff for the first coronary intensive care unit in the Frankfurt Hospital, which was King's Daughters at the time.
Wow.
In retrospect, I probably would have enjoyed going into music therapy, but that wasn't a widely offered major.
What is music therapy?
You work with psychiatric patients in music, and that would have blended both of my interests, but unfortunately it wasn't a major that was at least anywhere around that I knew of.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. So what brought you to Morehead, Kentucky?
Don Mantooth brought me to Morehead, Kentucky. Excuse me. He, after we left Israel, he really wanted to get back into the pastoral ministry. And I prayed that we would land in a community with a university. And when Alvin Wheeler, who was the chairman of the Pulpit Search Committee at the time, contacted us, I was really, really happy. And so we came.
Well, sound like you were blessed with that search committee.
We really were. He was wonderful, and everybody on the committee was just really so positive, and we just felt like we were in the right place.
Everyone has a hobby. What hobbies do you have?
My hobbies have always centered around sewing. I used to make my own clothing and clothing for the children. I made Molly's christening gown. She was christened in the Methodist church that they were attending at the time of her birth. And Dawn actually officiated at this christening ceremony. And then she wore it again here when she was dedicated here at First Baptist.
You've traveled a lot.
Yes.
Of all the places you've been, what is or was your favorite meal?
Oh my. I love food. I love all kinds of food. I would have to say that a souvlaki meal in Athens, Greece was one of my favorites. I love Mediterranean food.
So, a souvlaki?
Souvlaki is, it's grilled chicken on a stick, and they always serve it with good greasy potatoes and a big Greek salad with feta cheese and black olives.
I could go for that, definitely. What's on your bucket list?
I would really like to go back to Israel one more time, and if I could look up my old Hebrew teacher, I would give anything to be able to see her again and share what has happened with the two of us in this 40-year interim.
Robin told us a little bit about her life there in Israel, going on camel rides and so forth.
Yeah.
Give us your side of the story.
Well, it was such an interesting place. We lived at Baptist Village most of the time we were there, which was just outside of Tel Aviv. And there was a railroad track behind our house that led to Aphek, which was a place where St. Paul was imprisoned. And there's a park there now. So occasionally I would pack a breakfast in a backpack of boiled eggs and pita and hummus and olives. And we would, and squash drink, which is like a Kool-Aid, but it's a syrup that you mix with water. We would walk down that railroad track to Aphek and have breakfast at the park. Every spring we would go to the Red Sea and camp. It was raw camping. We had to take our own water. And I had it down to the logistics, down to the last teaspoon of salt that we would need. And we just slept on the sand. And we had a tent, but we usually slept outside under the stars. It was a marvelous experience.
Of all the characters and personalities in the Bible, except for Jesus, who would you like to spend the day with?
This is going to be an odd answer. When I was about 4 and 5 years old, my dad had brought a nativity set home from Italy after the war. He bought it with cigarettes, which came in his meals ready to eat, but he didn't smoke. And he bought this nativity set with the cigarettes. And there were about 12 characters in it, counting the animals and the angel. And it was an exquisite set. In fact, an exact replica of it was featured on the cover of Time magazine back in the 60s. He and my mother researched the costuming for it, and she made all of the costumes. Well, I asked him one day why there was an extra woman in the nativity set. And he said that was probably the innkeeper's wife. And she probably had to help Mary. So as I got to be older, I thought, well, she acted as the midwife. I think the innkeeper and his wife get a bad rap. Mary could not have delivered inside the inn because the whole inn would have been declared unclean. So I've always thought I'd like to talk to the innkeeper's wife and see what role she played. And
You know, we never think about the minor characters.
yeah, I know.
That were kind of on the sideline, and you know, they're not out front.
Yep.
Interesting. I want to go back to your time there in Israel. Was the language issue? Was that an issue? The language barrier?
It was in some parts. When we lived in Baptist Village, we had to do all of our business in Hebrew in town. When we lived closer into Tel Aviv, we lived in a diplomatic community for about a year or a year and a half. That wasn't a problem because you could go to the store and like the butcher got to know who you were, and whoever stepped up before him, he would speak whatever language he knew they spoke. He was incredible. He would go German, French, English, Italian, whatever there was. And it was, but that was an interesting place to live. Robin sang for Moshe Dayan, a party that he had at his house when she was just a child at the American Embassy, or American International School. Neat things like that happened occasionally to us.
These are experiences most people never get to enjoy.
Yeah, I know. I think that the one that stands out, the one experience that stands out most is my accompanying the victim of the war in southern Lebanon. She was a mother of 3. She was about 30-some years old, and she died. And we had a ministry called the Good Fence Ministry, where we would bring people over who were injured in southern Lebanon and take them to a hospital in Haifa for treatment, and then bring them back to the Good Fence to deliver them to their families. And I met the press secretary for the Christian forces in southern Lebanon. Her dad was the general, and his press secretary was there, and he had written a letter to President Carter, and he wanted me to read the letter so that I could edit it. So I did that, and he went to the Good Fence with us, and a newspaper or a news broadcaster was there from CBS News. His last name was Siemens. He just died a couple of years ago. He read the letter to President Carter. He thought President Carter would be sympathetic because he was a Christian.
So, you've been here at First Baptist Church for a long time, and I know you've had a positive impact on people, the congregation, and so forth. But how has First Baptist Church impacted your life?
Well, I think it has shown me that people can change their theological views on things. When all of the trouble came with the Southern Baptist Convention, going sort of a different route than what our heritage had taught us. I mean, I remember Don standing at this pulpit saying in 1987 when we returned from the convention, this is not who I am as a Southern Baptist or as a Baptist. And so if you need to find somebody else to pastor the church, you need to let me know that. But the church accepted it, accepted us, and and grew. We grew together as a church. We studied the scriptures that were questioned, like the role of the women in ministry here. You know, we didn't feel like there were any second-class citizens in God's kingdom, and that women should be allowed to participate and minister. Things like that, and the church grew with us, and we grew together.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you that you would like to share?
Well, I just appreciate the way that the church took us in. I mean, Don even had a hard time finding a place to do a trial sermon. I mean, for the pulpit committee to go hear him outside the church, not for the trial sermon, but they took us in and loved us. They loved our children. We enjoyed opening our house to them, especially at Christmas time. We would have open houses on the hill. Like I said, they're just like family. They're more than family.
This has been a conversation with First Baptist Church. I'm Larry Dixon, and with me today has been Suzanne Mantooth. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.